Well, it's wonderful to be here in Charleston. Thank you for the warmth of your welcome and to the rector for his welcome to this marvellous church. While we were enjoying that extraordinarily wonderful evensong, I was reflecting on what it was that makes us Anglican. And I thought, is it the wonderful music? Is it the marvellous singing of the choir? Is it the great content of that service of worship? All of the scripture in that service. But no, I realized finally what makes you an Anglican was when Dean McKeechie announced that there were two cars in the parking lot and one was blocking the other. And I thought some things translate around the entire globe. I did notice one other difference, you'll forgive me, in the order for evensong. I very nearly sang it out. "O Lord, save the Queen." I noticed that had been replaced by "O Lord, save the state." That, of course, may be harking back to 1776 and so on. But I do hope that you are all enjoying taxation with representation. Maybe I should have kept that for halfway through to make sure you were still awake. But thank you for the warmth of your welcome to Bishop Lawrence and to all of you for the welcome to your city. This conference, which has become a regular feature of the landscape, is important because, in essence, this conference which we are gathered here for is not a conference about structure. It's not a conference about ecclesiastical politics, but it's a conference of ideas, a conference of biblical Anglicans coming together in order to seek to understand our tradition in all its glory and for the sake of the gospel. The overall title, The Once and Future Church, reminds us that historic Anglicanism takes two things equally seriously. The history, who we are, where we have come from, what has formed and shaped us, and the future prospects of the gospel. How are we to bring the transforming power of Christ to our world? And what I want to do this evening is to explore with you the flourishing of Anglicanism in the 18th and 19th centuries, all in under an hour. So it's approximately 27 minutes on each century. Oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing my great Redeemer's praise. Penned by Charles Wesley in 1739. Written specifically for the miners and the colliers of the Kingswood district of Bristol, a city in the west of England, about 80 miles or so to the west of London. Written to be sung at the open-air rallies where the great leaders of the revival, particularly Charles's brother John and George Whitfield, preached to thousands upon thousands of people. The outbreak of what has become known as the Evangelical Revival was as surprising to its participants as it was to observers. These events, awakenings or outpourings, were local, national, and importantly, transnational. And they were characterized by a number of key features, a number of special distinguishing marks. First, there was a recovery of intense piety in personal devotion. The early participants in the revival rose early, prayed deeply, and prayed often. Second, there was a rejection of superficiality in faith in favor of something which was more substantial and transformative. Third, there was a recovery of the doctrinal tenets of the Reformation, which, of course, we should not forget are the essential building blocks of Anglicanism. Alongside these features, the revival was also marked by a renewed expectation of the experience of God in the life of the believer, and by a passion to bring the gospel and the message of the gospel to all people through the preaching of the new birth. These awakenings were not only transnational, but also transdenominational. However, in England especially, there was a particularly significant impact upon the life and ministry of the established Church of England. And I want to argue this evening in the first half of my talk that these emphases from the revival are deeply and essentially Anglican, and that we can learn a great deal from the experience of our forebears. In essence, the full flower of Anglicanism in the 18th century was built upon a traditional faith expressed through radical methods, but within established church order. A traditional faith expressed through radical methods, but within an established order. Now, in order to proclaim the new birth, one also had to experience the phenomenon as a participant. Conversion is a crucial factor in the story of the revival. John Wesley's conversion in 1738, "I felt my heart strangely warmed," is perhaps the archetypal conversion experience. But in the build-up to the outbreak of the revival, it was preceded by both George Whitefield, "The burden that had so heavily oppressed me was taken from me," and also by the Welshman Howell Harris, "I was receiving pardon on account of the blood. I lost my burden. I went home leaping for joy." Both of those experiences dated to 1735. It was the experience of conversion that equipped the evangelical leaders with boldness for the work of proclamation. And what united those three individuals, John Wesley, George Whitefield, and Howell Harris? They were all Anglicans. How was the message to be proclaimed? In February 1739, Whitefield found the pulpits of the city of Bristol being closed to him. As we heard earlier, it was an experience that was repeated in Whitefield's ministry when he came to this side of the Atlantic. And so in that year, he proceeded famously to the Kingswood district, a community of miners and colliers, hard-working, poor labourers. A district a few miles outside the city of Bristol. Whitefield, as many of you will know, was scathing about many of the clergy, the so-called carnal clergy. These miners, he said, were as sheep having no shepherds. And so he took a momentous step, and he recorded it in his journal. After dinner, therefore, I went upon a mount and spake to as many people as came unto me. There were upwards of 200. Blessed be God that I have now broken the ice. I believe I never was more acceptable to my master than when I was standing to teach those hearers in the open fields. Some may censure me, but if I thus pleased men, I should not be the servant of Christ. It was a historic turning point. Within a month, both John and Charles Wesley, in different settings, in different circumstances, had made the same break with tradition. Equally unsurprising, over the next few days, Whitefield clashed with the Chancellor of the Diocese of Bristol, who threatened to suspend him for preaching without a license. And even in just telling this story, we will begin to gather some of these tensions as we go along the way. The relative place of freedom and order. Within a month, Whitefield was preaching to crowds of 10,000 in this Kingswood district of Bristol. Indeed, in his journal, there are references to preaching to 20,000, but I'm unsure how they counted the numbers when it got quite so big. He urged the Wesleys to come and join him. John Wesley, in his own journal for the 31st of March, 1739, was so shocked by what was going on, he commented thus: "Having been all my life, till very lately, so tenacious of every point relating to decency and order, that I should have thought the saving of souls almost a sin if it had not been done in a church." Just over a month later, still in the spring of 1739, Wesley recorded, also in Bristol, at 4 p.m, I submitted to be more vile, and proclaimed in the highways the glad tidings of salvation, speaking from a little eminence in the ground adjoining to the city, to about 3,000 people. Hence, John's famous quote in a letter of the 11th of June, 1739, "I have now no parish of my own, nor probably ever shall. I look upon all the world as my parish. This is the work I know God has called me to do, and I am sure that his blessing attends it." Traditional doctrine was being recovered. New methods were being adopted, and the tension between freedom and order was beginning to emerge. Let me now illustrate this by telling you the story, at least in outline, of one great Anglican pioneer of the revival. Probably little known in the USA, but barely better known in the United Kingdom. Let me tell you the story of William Grimshaw of Howarth. Now, the parish of Howarth is set among the rugged hills and the steep valleys of Yorkshire in the north of England. And in the 18th century, it was the scene of remarkable events and the setting for the ministry of a remarkable person. William Grimshaw was the minister of Howarth from 1742 until his death in 1763. He formed deep and lasting friendships with both of the Wesleys and also with George Whitefield, all of whom preached regularly in his parish. Now, Grimshaw showed a distinct ability to rise above the theological disputes that divided those better-known evangelists. He adopted new methods to proclaim the new birth, but did so whilst carefully walking the tightrope of freedom and church order. He itinerated, that is, he travelled from place to place with the message of the gospel. He attended John Wesley's early Methodist conferences. Wesley began to gather his lay preachers in conference from 1742, and many of these early conferences were attended by many clergy from within the established Church of England. Though Grimshaw balked at proposals to permit lay preachers to preside over the sacrament of the supper. Grimshaw was a hero to some and mad Grimshaw to others. He generated opposition from other clergy, had to negotiate his way around archbishops, and suffered immense personal tragedy during his ministry, with the successive death of 2 wives and 1 daughter. His greatest concern was for the spiritual welfare of those in his care, and he was as much at home speaking to a small group gathered in a cottage as standing alongside Whitefield preaching to thousands in the churchyard. Henry Venn, another Anglican pioneer from the time, preached Grimshaw's funeral sermon. This is what Henry Venn said of Grimshaw. "Witness ye moors and mountains, how often he was in perils by the way, whilst carrying the glad tidings of salvation to some company of poor cottagers. In this work, no roads were too dangerous, no refreshment too coarse, no lodging too hard, no discouragement too great. Grimshaw was born in 1708, ordained in 1732, and in 1735 he married, but tragically, just 4 years later, his wife, Sarah, died, leaving Grimshaw at this point the curate of a village called Todmorden, nestling in the hills between Lancashire and Yorkshire. And at just 31 years of age, a widower with 2 children under the age of 5. In the depth of his turmoil, he experienced a resurgence of faith. He married again, and he arrived in the parish of Howarth in 1742. There was an immediate clash over his appointment, which was technically under the control of the vicar of Bradford, but funded independently. Power and money strike again. Certainly by 1744, Grimshaw had experienced the full power of evangelical conversion. This little town, this little parish of Howarth, presented spiritual challenges from the beginning. Life was tough and spiritual input modest, to say the least. Funerals often descended into drunkenness. On Sundays, the market in nearby Bradford was infinitely more attractive to many than the pulpit of the parish church. And Sunday sport involved football, that is soccer, on the moors. I was preaching in Houston over the last weekend, and I realized when I stood in the pulpit at the 11 o'clock service at St. Dunstan's, and I don't really know where St. Dunstan's is other than Houston, that one of the great football teams, American football teams from the state, was playing in some grand game. So I wasn't actually sure I was going to have anybody sitting in the congregation. But up in the moors and the mountains of Yorkshire, it was the soccer, which was the alternative attraction to church on a Sunday. Sometimes in the modern age, we think these things are only contemporary challenges. These things have been challenges for much longer than we often realise. But you see, Grimshaw adopted a particular tactic. I'm not sure the rector of St. Philip's or the rector of any other church in Charleston or England would dare to adopt this tactic. Grimshaw expected attendance upon divine service. And if they didn't come by choice, he would go out to find them. And he would dress up, he would disguise himself, and he would go out onto the moors to track down the footballers. And he would only at the last minute reveal who he was to the shock and horror of the youth of the parish. On another occasion, Grimshaw dressed in disguise as a poor beggar in order to shame one of his parishioners for their miserly attitude, knocking at their door and being sent away and then revealing himself as the rector of the parish. John Newton reported that Grimshaw frequently left the church during the singing of the psalm in order to round people up to come in to hear the word of God. There are suggestions that the psalm concerned was Psalm 119. I'm not making that up. There are suggestions that it was Psalm 119, but I have to say, as a historian, I do think the suggestion is apocryphal. But he nevertheless went out to round people up. Now, Grimshaw's methods were classic Methodist. Now, when I typed that in my notes, Word 2007 would only allow me to use a capital letter for the word Methodist. It is absolutely fundamental to understanding the nature of the revival in England that Methodist was lowercase m before it was uppercase m. He formed classes and small groups, and as time went on, he made use of lay assistants in his parish. In a 1747 letter to John Wesley, Grimshaw reported on his practices of monthly visitation, that is, of gathering 8 to 10 families together in dwelling places scattered around his parish for teaching and exhortation. He would preach on a Sunday often to thousands, and yet a crucial part of his method was gathering small groups together in homes around his parish. Itinerancy was, as we mentioned earlier, a significant characteristic of the early pioneers, frowned upon at best and thoroughly opposed by many clergy. The Church of England was built upon its parochial system, and the geographical boundaries of the structure were policed by the local clergy. In theory, the arrangement provided for ministry to each and every place. The question that faced the pioneers in the revival was what to do if the gospel of the new birth was not being proclaimed. By 1746, the effects of the ministry in Howarth were beginning to be felt in neighbouring parishes. And many thousands of people flocked to this small town, this small village, to hear Grimshaw. And so the invitations gradually came in to Grimshaw to preach the message elsewhere. This provoked the ire of the parish clergy concerned. There is a famous story of Grimshaw stepping over the parish boundary in the company of John Wesley into the parish of Colne, C-O-L-N-E, in Lancashire. And he met the vicar of Colne, armed with a mob with sticks, and Wesley and Grimshaw were beaten up by the vicar of the neighbouring parish. Same year, 1746, brought more tragedy to Grimshaw, with his second wife, Elizabeth, dying from a fever. And it was from about this time, from 1746, 1747, that Grimshaw opened his pulpit to the Wesleys and to George Whitefield and to other leaders of the revival. In respect of itinerant preaching, he wrote that his mind was, quote, deeply affected with strong impressions to preach the gospel abroad, and fearing to be disobedient to what I trust was the heavenly call. You won't be surprised to hear that Grimshaw generated many enemies. And his accusers and opponents brought charges against him before the new Archbishop of York, Matthew Hutton, in May 1748. I hope you're beginning to gather as I tell the story where these tensions start emerging, and we can try and apply some of these lessons to today. Charges were tabled against him before the Archbishop of York in May 1748. It's a fascinating encounter. The Archbishop questioned Grimshaw and said to him, how many parishioners attended upon the Lord's Supper when you arrived in the parish? Grimshaw answered that 12 communicants gathered for the Lord's Supper when he first arrived in the parish. Hutton said, how many gather for the Lord's Supper now? And Grimshaw reported that the numbers had risen to 400 or 500 on a regular basis, and nearer 1,200 in the summer. Hutton declared that he could find no fault with Grimshaw. In fact, he added, I wish all my clergy were like William Grimshaw. So that shows that episcopal office and episcopal order can encourage radical methods from within an established church order. From this point on, Grimshaw began to itinerate regularly on what became known as the Great Howarth Round, travelling over the course of 5 days, hundreds of miles, but on every occasion returning to his own parish to preach on the Sunday, visiting societies, preaching to groups large and small, inside the churches if welcomed, outside if not. His diary reveals that in 1 week he preached 14 times and in another 23. Wesley reported in 1761 how the problem had been solved in this parish church of Howarth to preaching to thousands of people. This is what Wesley wrote in his journal. The church would not near contain the people. However, Mr. Grimshaw had provided for this by fixing a scaffold on the outside of one of the windows, through which I went after prayers, and the people likewise all sent out into the churchyard. The afternoon congregation was larger still. What has God wrought in the midst of these rough mountains? Well, all of this, again, you will be not surprised to hear, took its toll on Grimshaw's health. In fact, he once described preaching as his health and food, and said, "Oh, that we may spend and be spent in preaching his everlasting gospel, in converting sinners and confirming believers." Grimshaw was absolutely worn out, and he died at the age of 54. Revival has perhaps fared best in frontier situations. In England, this may be seen in the flourishing of Methodism in the Pennine Hills of Yorkshire, which I've been describing, and also in Cornwall in the far southwest of the British Isles. Grimshaw was certainly a pioneer. He illustrates for historians of the revival some fascinating characteristics. First, it is essential to recognize the centrality and vitality of the revival within the established Church of England. Capitalizing the word Methodist can disguise the fact that no separate denomination existed at this time, and that many Methodists, in fact, all Methodists, worshipped in the parish churches, as well as meeting together in their classes, societies, and bands. Second, Grimshaw showed a firm grasp of the classic Reformed doctrine of justification by faith alone. That is, that salvation comes through faith in Christ alone, rather than through living a good life. However, the consequences of that, with his moderate Calvinism, was that he considered himself utterly bound to Christ, freed from sin, but bound to Christ, to proclaim the new birth. Third, Grimshaw was clear that the true Church of England, as reflected in its formularies and liturgy, its prayer book and articles, reflected the doctrinal position of the Reformation. Hence, not only was there no point in departing from the Church, through its opportunities, its parochial provision, and so on, there were many advantages in being part of the established Church. And fourthly, unity in Christ meant cooperation across denominational boundaries because of shared belief and doctrine. Like Whitefield, Grimshaw was a moderate Calvinist. Again, I haven't made up that expression. That's a historian's expression that is used in describing Anglican evangelicalism, moderate Calvinism. Believing in God's predestination of those he will save, rather than Wesley's emphasis on free will. Like Whitefield, he rejected the Wesleyan doctrine of the possibility of Christian perfection. Well, at least Christian perfection this side of the eschaton. However, driven by his pioneering ministry in a pioneering setting, by the preaching of the new birth, he remained the closest of friends with both of the Wesleys and with George Whitefield. And in fact, Charles Wesley had increasing scruples about preaching outside of the parish boundaries. Again, just an illustration of the tensions that we are dealing with. Grimshaw's moderate adoption of extraordinary measures, his cooperation across denominational lines, his adherence to the established church, and his unity of purpose and friendship with the Wesleys in Whitfield are a mark of his significant place and contribution. So, a provisional conclusion as we get to the halfway stage. Looking at Anglicanism in full flower in the 18th century, what do we see? We see classic doctrine. We see a desire for church order. We see radical method. And for Anglicans, radical methods within church order are possible because for Anglicans, church order, though important, is provisional. That is what distinguishes Anglicanism from both Rome and Geneva. For Rome and Geneva, church order is not provisional. For Anglicanism, radical method is possible because we consider church order important but provisional. The common conviction from Hooker onwards is that church order is for the well-being of the church, but its principal role is to ensure sound doctrine. Order without content is not Anglican. So we need to be brave and courageous when it comes to the priority of evangelism. We need to ensure that church order serves the gospel and not vice versa. And I wonder, if I may be allowed to wonder, if many of the problems of the Episcopal Church currently stem from a centralized and legal view of church order, its priority over evangelism, forgetting that for Anglicanism, church order is provisional. Well, you may want to come back at me on that at the end. Let me turn now to the flourishing of Anglicanism in the 19th century. There are, of course, many claimants and examples which could be given of a flourishing Anglicanism from missionary societies to monastic communities. However, I want to concentrate on one person and two examples from his life in order to illustrate both the continuity and the discontinuity with what we have looked at so far. And as I tell the story, try to pick up what resonates from what I have already said and what is similar and what is different. You will all have heard of William Wilberforce, who campaigned against the slave trade for upward of 20 years. Well, I want to introduce you to a less well-known, but in impact and theology, a more significant and important personality. Let me introduce you to Anthony Ashley Cooper, the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury, born in 1801, died in 1885, so I can meet the expectation of talking about the 19th century almost in total. Shaftesbury was converted to evangelical faith around 1826, a year after he entered the English Parliament. And he served in the English Parliament, firstly in the House of Commons, then in the House of Lords, for 60 years, from 1825 until his death in 1885. He was involved in the establishment of numerous significant missionary societies concerned with the proclamation of the gospel, but also, significantly, concerned with the transformation of society. And his vision for the transformation of society was Christian men and women coming together in voluntary societies so that the gospel would be proclaimed and care for the bodily needs of individuals would also be set forth. Alongside all of that, he campaigned in Parliament for the necessary legislative provision to protect the most vulnerable. At his funeral, it is estimated that over 100,000 people lined the streets of London for his funeral service at Westminster Abbey. By the early 19th century, the revival had become institutionalized. Although I don't have time to talk about this evening, it's completely remarkable to me about how institutionalized Methodism, with a capital M, became so quickly. After Wesley had ordained the workers for the Americas, was it in 1783? I think I've got the year right. within a few years, the Methodists as a denomination were already facing radical dissent from what later became the primitive Methodists. Within the Church of England, evangelical clergy had gained a foothold as rectors, missionary societies had been founded, and perhaps even a degree of respectability had replaced the pioneer spirit. I did once hear Anglicanism defined as politeness and good manners. Theological disputes of a different kind, and which need not detain us this evening, came to occupy both intellectual and ecclesiastical space. Shaftesbury was an enigma, deeply conservative politically and theologically, deeply committed to the established order of the Church of England, equally committed to radical approaches to mission, to social welfare, to the welfare of the city. He himself had a darker side that struggled with depression, with self-doubt and anxiety. Problem is, when I read an expression like that, it seems to be like the normal experience of most of us, actually. Depression, self-doubt and anxiety throughout most of his life. Florence Nightingale commented that had the Earl of Shaftesbury not been devoted to the reform of the asylum, he would have been in one. But he was a man of great intellect and principle. He was repeatedly offered cabinet office throughout his long political life by the political leadership of both of England's political parties at the time. In 1866 alone, he turned down 3 great offices of state because it would have required him to surrender his life's Christian work. In Shaftesbury, we see first a continued passion for radical approaches to mission, and second, an equally passionate concern for the transformation of society. And again, I want to argue that these 2 emphases are also deeply Anglican. In line with the pioneering emphases of the revival 100 years earlier in the previous century, Shaftesbury wished to ensure that the worship of the established Church of England, the liturgy, was accessible to the working class, and that it should have an evangelistic intent. Inevitably, because of the sort of individual he was, and I suppose in classic evangelical style at the time, he also thought it should be freed from undue power or influence in the hands of the bishops. In 1857, worship services commenced in Exeter Hall in London, aimed at the working class. 2 things just to note there. Exeter Hall was not a church. It doesn't exist anymore. It was a meeting place where many of the great mission societies, both evangelistic and social, would hold their gatherings, their meetings, their celebrations. The second thing to remember is that on Sunday mornings in 19th century England, when the great and the good were in the church, most of the working class were unable to attend because many of them were in domestic service, they were preparing the meals, they were running the house. And so one of the principles behind the introduction of evening services was to ensure access to worship for those who were unable to attend in the mornings. Some clergy attempted to use an Act of Parliament, the 1855 Religious Worship Act, to prevent the services from happening in unconsecrated buildings. Note here the use of law to impose order. Many of these themes come back again and again. And now to Shaftesbury, the progress of the gospel was paramount. And so in Parliament, he introduced an amendment in the House of Lords. He introduced an amendment to the Act to provide for occasional worship services in any building. Countered a lot of opposition from clergy and bishops. But in the end, he concocted a compromise with the Archbishop of Canterbury and supported a proposal that allowed services of worship to be held on occasion in any building, provided the sanction of the bishop was given. Shaftesbury's prime commitment was to ensuring that as many as possible could hear the gospel message of salvation. Nothing should be allowed to stand in the way of that objective. The Sunday evening services at Exeter Hall were very successful, and then thought began to be given as to how this principle could be extended. This is how Shaftesbury in his diary described one of these services. An attendance of more than 3,000, order, decency, attention, and even devotion. They sang well and lustily, and repeated the responses to the litany, the only part of the liturgy used. Another service this evening, fuller than before, hundreds sent away. In January 1860, 5 London theatres opened for public worship. During the course of these theatre services, the average weekly attendance was approximately 20,000. 20,000 people attending services in London theatres in the 1860s. Many of these were listening to the Word of God for the first time. Shaftesbury himself assisted in many of these services, reading from the Bible, and it was, of course, mainly the poor, the labourers, the factory workers, and the domestic staff who formed the congregations. If you thought this was all going to be wonderfully straightforward, then, of course, it wasn't. On the 24th of February 1860, Lord Dungannon rose in the House of Lords in order to propose a resolution declaring such services, led by the clergy of the Church of England, to be irregular, inconsistent with order, and injurious to the advancement of religion. The Earl of Shaftesbury rose from his seat. The services, he said, were aimed at those who did not frequent regular places of worship. Note the emphasis on those who have not yet heard. In addition, he said, many in London were nomadic and moved from one place to another. These circumstances, he said, required special means. Many of the Church of England and Nonconformity had joined together in this enterprise, and Shaftesbury praised this unity. He argued that these services strengthened the cause of the Church, and added this: I question whether any human being or any law has the power of preventing a clergyman in his capacity as a Christian citizen from performing that great duty, the salvation of souls, in season and out of season, at all times and in all places, to any who may be disposed to hearken. He then quoted a letter from a clergyman. It was actually a letter written to the Bishop of London. I presume the right of Christian men to exhort an ungodly multitude wherever found ought not to be interfered with. And it was only as a Christian man that I addressed the multitude in the Garrick Theatre. I wore no ecclesiastical dress and used no part of the church service. And the letter went on to complain that the Church of England, quote, despite the pressing and fearful necessity, is bound so tightly by rule and rubric and law and custom that she can do none of the work. Shaftesbury described these theatre services as a great work, a good work, a deeply needful work. Some important points just need to be noted. The issues here were the same as in the revival of the previous century. What was the appropriate relationship between the freedom to proclaim the gospel and appropriate church order? To some, the gospel triumphed over order. To others, order itself was paramount. Indeed, to some, order had become the gospel. Now, one more thing I want to cover in my last few minutes. I want to turn, finally, to the transformation of society. And the example I'm going to give from the early 19th century was the emergence of the emotive issue of climbing boys. The wealthier parts of society, including those who'd made substantial fortunes from the Industrial Revolution in England, demanded that their chimney flues be cleaned. So did the insurance companies, in order to prevent, of course, the outbreak of fire. The problem at this point is there was no mechanized method, no machinery available to clean the chimney flues. How were these narrow flues, some as narrow as 18 inches, to be cleaned? The answer lay in young children. Although from 1788 master sweeps were not supposed to take apprentices under the age of 8, given the narrowness of the flues, the younger the children, the better. Shaftesbury observed in Parliament that the rich preferred not to ask how their chimneys are cleaned. Parents, culpable in selling their children to the sweeps, simply gave the employers the assurance they needed on the age of the child. Children as young as 4, 5, and 6 years of age were engaged in this terrible and miserable existence. The sweeps employed incentives in order to encourage the child to climb the chimney. These incentives included hammering nails into the feet of the child dangling down from the chimney to make sure they went up rather than down. They included the lighting of fires in the hearth in order to force the child up the chimney. The impact on physical health included deformity of the spine, of the knee and the ankle joints. And as well as climbing these narrow flues, these young children also had to carry heavy bags of soot, each weighing 20 to 30 pounds, over long distances. Burns, sores, stunted growth and disease were prevalent, as were poor diet and lodging, and the absence of any education, religious or moral provision. In one of these related campaigns, the Pope Laureate of England said, "Who is it who will take up the case of this white slave trade?" That was Robert Southey. Once a boy had become too big to climb the chimney, he was discarded onto the street to be replaced by another. There were many deaths, often caused by burning and suffocation and terrible injuries. Shaftesbury campaigned against these practices for nearly 50 years. In 1840, he said in Parliament that he trusted that the system of sweeping chimneys by children would shortly pass away, for it had led to more misery and more degradation than prevailed in any other Christian country. He added that he had personal knowledge of the employment of a child of 4.5 and another one of 6 as chimney sweeps. Shaftesbury attempted to buy out children bound to the sweeps, and his evangelistic motives were, of course, always present. He wrote in his diary about one particular child that he hoped that this child, quote, "will this day be conveyed from his soot hole to the Union School on Norwood Hill, where under God's blessing and a special merciful grace, he will be trained in the knowledge and love and faith of our common Lord and only Saviour, Jesus Christ." During the 1840s and 1850s, the legislation proved generally ineffective. And Shaftesbury lamented the lack of government support. "Not a word of sympathy for the wretched children," he said. "And again I must bow to this mysterious providence that leaves these outcasts their horrible destiny and nullifies, apparently at least, all our efforts to rescue them in body and soul." His depression and gloom came through in his diary on the 21st of May, 1854. Sunday, very sad and low about the loss of the sweeps bill, the prolonged sufferings, the terrible degradation, the licensed tyranny, the helpless subjection, the enormous mass of cruelty and crime on the part of parents and employers are overwhelming. The prospect is gloomy. I must persevere, and by God's help so I will. For however dark the view, however contrary to all argument the attempt, however painful and revolting the labour, I see no scriptural reason for desisting, and the issue of every toil is in the hands of the Almighty. Finally, in 1875, after some 25 deaths over the previous quarter of a century, the end of the practice came with a further bill introduced to Parliament by Shaftesbury. He stated that the legislation concerned the temporal and eternal welfare of some thousands of children, the most oppressed, degraded, and tortured creatures on the face of the earth. He said that he had given to Parliament but a sample of the atrocities perpetrated under this satanic system. The Act effectively ended a century of oppression. Shaftesbury had pioneered and championed the campaign for protection for 35 years. The Earl was 74 years old when the Act finally passed. For Shaftesbury, the eternal destiny and welfare of a chimney sweep was equally but no less essential as their temporal and bodily welfare. These campaigns were remarkable. The character, tenacity, and skill of the Earl ensured that the case and its evidence was constantly before Parliament and indeed the nation at large. So we see in the flourishing of Anglicanism in the 19th century a continuation of some of the themes from the revival. The priority of evangelism, the adoption of special means for special circumstances, and the continued tension of the relationship of freedom to church order, law, and structure. But we also see in the 19th century a vision for the transformation of society as well as for the salvation of the individual. So what conclusions can we now draw? How and why does Anglicanism flourish? Anglicanism flourishes because it understands the primacy of the gospel and the importance of church order, rather than the primacy of church order and the importance of the gospel. This permits radical evangelistic methodology within the boundaries of a vital but provisional church order. Those that seek to make order primary rather than provisional, those that seek to make order, law, rule, and regulation primary over the gospel are not truly Anglican. But we have seen that tension over time. Equally, Anglicans will have a concern for the transformation of society alongside that of the individual. We see these emphases in the work of the 18th century revival, and we see them further in the life and ministry of the Earl of Shaftesbury. Were there tensions? Yes, of course. How do we deal with those tensions? Remain Anglican, faithful to the historic faith, committed to the proclamation of the new birth, recognizing order, but as a secondary issue to the gospel, and work for the transformation of both individual and society. And if others find this unacceptable, well, I offer to finish the advice of Silina, the Countess of Huntingdon, another prominent figure in the revival whose story I have not told this evening, facing her chapels and chaplains being forced out of the Church of England by the result of legal proceedings. This is what she said: "I am to be cast out of the church for what I have been doing these 40 years, speaking and living for Jesus Christ." Words of a true Anglican. Thank you.